Well, Prashan, welcome to Think Global Do Justice. I feel like, recording in Sri Lanka, I have to keep saying that because we're just trying to get the recording to work properly. But this in some ways it feels both timely and happy to finally be at this point recording a podcast with you. How you doing today, brother?
I'm doing well, Brandon. Thank you so much, and thank you for your patience as well. We'll definitely struggle with the technology and the time zones and all that, but glad to be part of the conversation.
There's something about recording with practitioners and leaders in Asia. I don't know what it is. I do better like Africa, people get in here okay, Latin America. Asia is a challenge. I don't know what it is. Maybe we all just need Elon to give us Starlink and then we'll all be happy. I don't know. Prashan, you are a friend of a friend. Dr. Gary Parrott and his wife Holly are wonderful people at our church, and he's the one who pointed me your direction and was sharing a little bit about what Global Unites does. And you guys have quite the operation, so I'm excited to jump into this conversation. Prashan, maybe we could just start with you introducing yourself and just sharing a little bit about you, your family, your background, and kind of what brought you into global peace building.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and I'm glad to connect and have this conversation. So, yeah, I was born and raised in Sri Lanka, just north of Colombo, the capital of the country. Sri Lanka is an island nation off the coast of India, the southern coast of India. The population of 22 million people and a country the size of the state of West Virginia. So we were really packed in here. And unfortunately, we grew up in the midst of a civil war. Just 1 year after, before I was born, Sri Lanka erupted into a brutal civil war that lasted for nearly 3 decades. It was the government and a rebel extremist group from an ethnic minority that led to a very gruesome reality growing up. There were this terrorist organization called the LTTE. They introduced suicide bombing to the world pretty much in combat, and they had child soldiers and kids who would just strap a bomb on their waist and walk into the capital and just blow themselves up. And every one of their cadres had a cyanide capsule, in a chain that they would bite out to just kill themselves. And so it was a very violent reality. But still, we were rather safer because we were in the capital where you'd only have attacks coming in, but we were not actually in the war zone in the north and east. So those people had to endure even greater challenges during the war. And it all led to the post-colonial reality. Sri Lanka was colonized first by the Portuguese, then by the Dutch, then by the British. And especially during the British era, the allegation was there was a lot of a divide and rule kind of governance system, pitting people across ethnic and religious lines to have an easier task of governing a country. And that pitting against each other based on existing animosity and existing tensions that were there for thousands of years, but it kind of renewed that. And once the colonial era ended, those renewed animosities were now ripe for a lot of injustices across ethnic lines and religious lines, which finally ended up in a civil war. So growing up in that, we saw how young people were brainwashed into believing violence was the only way, a violent culture was forming. And we realized, what if we can end the cycles of violence? Since independence, almost every 15 to 18 years, we've had some violent struggle, some level of extremism. So my whole question was, can young people, can a new generation break the cycles of violence? And that was my question that I was pursuing, and then eventually the work that I stepped into.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the history. South Asia is, I've been to the region. I've been to India, but it's such a fascinating history, and even what you're sharing is probably it could potentially be news to a lot of our listeners. So I'm looking forward to diving in more. Um, Prashan, as you talk about the colonial piece, but then also kind of like building from some of the other tensions that were already there. As we kind of stand in 2026, how do you still potentially see um, the legacy, the negative legacy of colonialism in Sri Lanka? How and specifically, I mean, obviously it led to war, which is not uncommon in other colonized countries where there's just ethnic conflict and so forth after after independence. But how do you kind of how do you kind of view that colonial piece now, decades later?
Yeah, so we just celebrated 76 years of independence. So you still have people who, our older generation, our grandparents' generation, they lived just the early stages of their life during the colonial era. So it's a distant past, but not too distant. And at the same time, what you realize is that at some point, we have to start saying, you can't take 500 years of colonial rule with the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British and say all of it was entirely negative, all of it was entirely good. It has the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the vestiges of all of it, some things we benefit from, some things we're still cursed by. But regardless, now today is a new day. And what we start saying is, as a generation, we can make better decisions. We can start building a new future for generations to come. But we can't afford to make the same mistakes over and over again. And in the words of Albert Einstein, who said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome. And so it seems like we have the ability to stop being insane by making some of the same mistakes. We don't need to be another generation of young people who embrace violence, who think that violence will bring about justice and healing. That delusion has been proven wrong over and over again. Violence is not going to bring about justice and sustainable peace and a thriving future for anybody. In fact, everyone's worse off. And so, how does this generation not make that mistake? So, that's how we're looking into the future, but also learning from the mistakes of the past and trying our best not to make those over and over again.
Yeah, that's helpful. Your guys' context is obviously, critical to the work that Global Unites does. You guys started in Sri Lanka, but now you're in quite a few countries with different youth movements. I kind of want to circle in on that. This was 30 years of war, right? Can you just kind of share with us just kind of the scope, the scale, where the ethnic elements, the religious elements, just kind of help us kind of understand what was going on, because it's really kind of that background that juxtaposes against just really the incredible work that Global Unites is doing, but also what it looks like to have hope. So can you just share with us a little bit more about those 30 years of conflict within Sri Lanka?
Yeah, so it's mainly in post-colonial times, after receiving independence, there were some laws that were passed. Obviously, Sri Lanka was the first democracy in Asia, especially in South Asia's first democracy, and immediate is majority rule. So if the majority felt treated unfairly during colonial rule, now they had power. They had overwhelming power. And so they were able to pass laws that were very clearly unjust, that were clearly unfair for ethnic and religious minorities, and that caused a lot of anxiety because the independence was accomplished by the contribution of people from different ethnic groups. People all worked together for a united Sri Lankan identity and freedom and independence. But now a new Sri Lanka that was independent was passing laws that were clearly disadvantageous towards minorities. And so eventually, younger people within minority groups started looking at it and saying, this is not working. The democratic structure is not working. The, the non-violently communicating about this and advocating for our rights is not working. Maybe we need to take up arms and fight and create a separate state. So that's kind of how it erupted. And this organization that took up arms really decided to become extremely brutal. And so growing up in it, so you had the fear of trying to destabilize the economy and the broader society was part of their strategy to try and fight for a separate state. And so the whole country was in peril. Sri Lanka had so much potential. When we received independence, we were Asia's second strongest economy. Like I said before, the first democracy in South Asia, with high rates of literacy, over 90% literate, very capable people, an island that's beautiful but also rich with natural resources. Everyone thought Sri Lanka was set to be the Switzerland of Asia. It was, even countries like Singapore, looked at Sri Lanka and said, we want to be like Sri Lanka. And today, Sri Lanka has a GDP per capita of around $4,000, whereas Singapore has GDP per capita of $60,000. So what we couldn't figure out is an inclusive Sri Lankan identity. Whereas countries like Singapore said, yes, we have very different ethnic groups, but we are Singaporean. They created an inclusive identity. They snuffed out extremist, divisive, racist realities to ensure there was a collective vision, a collective dream for a country, which unfortunately Sri Lanka wasn't able to create. And that led to these cycles of violence. And that's kind of what inspired us to say we need to create that an inclusive Sri Lankan identity, a collective vision for the people, and this bickering and mistrust and fear and segregated lifestyles from our own people is not going to do any of us any good.
Yeah. It reminds me of Why Nations Fail, if you're familiar with that book by Darren Asamoglu. He and Robinson, they talk about the critical importance of inclusive governing systems that lead to countries doing well. And it's almost kind of interesting for people that maybe aren't familiar with Sri Lanka, or including myself, to kind of hear you say, hey, we had a good economy, we have natural resources and so forth. Sometimes I'm not saying like, oh, the resource curse has to be real, but you do see a trend sometimes. Sometimes when there are resources available, sometimes that doesn't lead to the growth that it could, right? And colonialism obviously enriched, like colonial powers enriched themselves by going into the global south and obtaining those resources. But even, you look places like Congo, where that continues to be the case, that rich in resources, but not in thriving communities. How do you kind of think through that aspect? And it wasn't that long ago that even in modern Sri Lanka, just in the last few years, you guys had some really turbulent economic times. How kind of like present day economy and society, describe that a little bit for us to kind of give us that picture.
Yeah, so you do have the reality of with these tensions and violence and instability, another curse that follows is a massive brain drain. We've had some of the best and brightest in our countries go back to the West or they go towards the West for better opportunities. They want stability, they want to grow, they want to see their children have a better world class education. And so we've lost quite a few people. So I think during the civil war years and a few years after, I think we've had about 3 million people leave Sri Lanka out of 20, our entire population 22. And then we had a recent economic collapse in 2022 that we may have lost another million. So it's one of the highest per capita rate of people leaving the country. And this is not people who are unemployed or struggling or not capable who are leaving. Visas are not provided for homeless people on the streets. Visas to these countries are provided for those who most likely would add value to their new home. And some stats even indicate that Sri Lankans who left Sri Lanka to the West are contributing almost the same to the GDP of their new country as our collective GDP here in this country. So when you look at that reality, you see the opportunity cost of this violence. And that's led and paved the way for even governance to be governed by mediocre people who are corrupt, who don't have a desire and a vision for the nation, a desire to serve. Obviously, the rhetoric sounds like they have a vision to serve and a desire to serve, but the reality is these are mediocre individuals, corrupt individuals, self serving individuals seem to be more and more the reality because once you have a population that's losing quite a bit of our best and brightest and maybe people who can really add value, even the political structure is left with people who are potentially bottom of the barrel. Now, that doesn't mean everybody in politics is that, but that's been a sad reality of the results. The proof is in the pudding. So the level of economic growth, the levels of corruption, the poverty, the unemployment, the inflation, all those things don't indicate to brilliant governance. And so that's
Yeah.
where we've been at. So that's the struggle. And so after the Civil War, it was an amazing opportunity. When the war ended, everybody thought, okay, now the economy is going to boom and we're going to see a thriving. And there was a bit of a spike, but governance, the government in place proved to be one of the most corrupt regimes of our history. Allegations of, one family was governing 80% of the country's budget was run by one family. And you can see the levels of corruption, nepotism, the lack of transparency. That's not a healthy environment for investors to come running in to Sri Lanka. And so we hurt ourselves. And then you have living beyond our means. Out of the 76 years of independence, we've only had four budgets that has been a budget surplus.
Mm.
Every national budget, we have a budget deficit. Now, countries with large economies and with the dollar currency, you can afford to have a deficit, not for too long, but you can afford to have a relative deficit and make up for it. But in our context, you live with a deficit, you live beyond your means for so long. And at one point, debt to GDP ratio was 120%. You know,
Mm.
due to the height of the economic devastation, our inflation was in triple digits. And so, how are you going to survive? And so, yeah, so we've made mistakes. And that's why when the economy collapsed in 2022, it was a very dark time again, where, people had to stay in line for gas for nearly uh, 18 hours. We had power cuts for 13 hours a day. We just didn't have dollars to even buy fuel and power internationally. It collapsed pretty fast. And so that's a
Yeah.
result of bad governance.
It's interesting. I mean, it's funny because you mentioned like, stronger economic powers can come out of multiple years of deficit. I think the US is trying to test to see exactly how many we can do because it's a little ridiculous over here in terms of our national debt as well as a year to year deficit. And what's interesting when you were talking about the GDP, and that a lot of those people that have, left the country are contributing as much GDP outside the country as is total within the country. That's an interesting thing. It also makes me think, I don't know if you have numbers on this, but one of the things that we've talked about is remittances. What do you have a rough idea of how much the Sri Lankan GDP is even actually just made up of remittances from people sending money into the country from outside? Any thoughts or insight on that?
Yeah, so remittances, you would hope that it is at a high level, but if your whole family packs up and leaves, and you have very little reason to send back money home, that hurts the economy. So, roughly speaking, it's about $7 billion that come back home for a GDP of around 88 to 95 billion during this time. It is important, but it's not a game changer. But when you compare it to how much they're actually making, but you do have a lower skill and middle skill employment, which predominantly dominates the Middle Eastern market. So Sri Lankans will go in uh, as maids and drivers and low skill jobs in the Middle East. Now they do have the rest of their family here, and they're not getting citizenship in the Middle East. So that money comes back home at a higher rate to what they earn. But those who end up in Canada and the U.S. and then Australia and the United Kingdom, that's at a lower rate coming back home. And the cost of living.
That's
So
in,
whatever they're making there, they've got to spend it on themselves to thrive. So it doesn't make a game changing reality of having that many people outside the country.
Yeah, huh. That is interesting. It was just interesting. Just kind of talked with Dr. Michael Pucci a while back now, but we were talking about remittances and actually remittances into the global South were, and this was before like Trump, cut USAID, and then the European countries started pulling out. Remittances were already like two or three times what international, what IDA is. And so it is interesting. It's interesting when you kind of break it down, like those lower wage workers in the Middle East send back a higher percentage, but it's really those people that go on to be doctors and engineers and so forth in Western countries that actually could be sending more money back. But like you said, cost of living and so forth, that makes sense. Prashan, I want to talk about the church. If I remember correctly, I believe your dad is a pastor. Tell me a little bit when we hear about the conflict, when we hear about just all these different things that you have been describing for us. What has been the role of the church in Sri Lanka? A vantage point from you being a PK, but tell us a little bit about that in kind of this context and this history.
Yes, I am a PK, and my father's been in the ministry for most of my life, continues to do so. And it's interesting that there are two religious groups in Sri Lanka that have an interesting positioning in the peace building process in Sri Lanka. One is the Islamic community in Sri Lanka, because most of the Islamic community do speak both languages. They do speak Tamil and Sinhala, and they are also very into business and trade. And so they're in between the people. It's kind of like a bridge community that has a role to play in the tensions between the Sinhalese and the Tamils. But among the Christian community also, you have Christians who are from both ethnic groups. You have Christians who are Tamil and Christians who are Sinhalese. So Christians had an interesting, unique opportunity where they worship together on a Sunday. And in many churches across Sri Lanka, you have a Sinhalese service and a Tamil service, just for language, make it an efficient service culturally and so on. But at least there was a place of gathering and there was more engaging. So while the country was still ablaze in violence, the church was a place that people came together. So we did have friendships to a certain extent within the church. And so the church needed to play a role of can you be a peacemaker in this context? But unfortunately, I don't feel collectively the church played enough of a role. It was very, it is a religious minority, and so you don't seem to have the power or the influence to be involved in a national issue. And so I feel that we may have failed collectively, but now as a generation, I see more and more people are saying we need to play a more active role as citizens of this country for the benefit of the nation. How do we bring shalom to our broader society? And the whole words of Christ, he called us to be the light of the world, and he never says be the light of the church. And sometimes it's very a subculture, a holy huddle, a safe space. In the midst of some levels of persecution as well, you're kind of tempted to stay and mind your business. But in a dark and broken society, if you are to be a light, you have to be where it's broken and darkest. And so the call is very clearly there. It's just now the practical manifestation of that call is what requires some work.
Yeah, I love that approach, and I sometimes wonder. I don't want to romanticize or anything, but sometimes it almost kind of seems like some of the most fervent disciples are in those places where they are a minority, where and I mean, what's cool is even you discussing that ethnic difference. There's a church here, just in the Pacific Northwest. It's a part of the same denomination as my own church, and it's a Chinese church, but they have multiple languages, and it's just here. It's just in Seattle. It's not like it's not super far away, but just thinking just the social good that it has, to and for them that's a lot of them are part of a diaspora movement, but yeah, there's just a beautiful opportunity for the church. Um, Okay, so tell us a little bit then about Global Unites. And I mean, we're talking about conflict transformation here. We're talking about, this is the context. It started in Sri Lanka. Kind of tell us a little bit about the genesis and then kind of the work that Global Unites is doing in Sri Lanka, but then even beyond.
Yeah. So Global Unites was born out of our work here in Sri Lanka as Sri Lanka Unites. We started off bringing young people across enemy lines to really engage with each other. What we found was 70% of Sri Lankan youth didn't have a friend outside their ethnicity or their religion. So in a small island, you still lived very segregated lives. In the Ministry of Education, you have 10,400 schools registered under the Ministry of Education, and only 120-ish schools had Sinhala and Tamil medium taught under the same roof. So it was almost as if it was institutionalized segregation, even though it wasn't. It felt like it. So when you don't have a friend across potential enemy lines, you tend to believe the worst about them. You are more afraid. You come to the worst conclusions. And when we started interviewing young people across the country, we found that asked them, tell us 10 things about the other community. 9 out of 10 things they said was negative. And both communities did the same. And then we asked, do you know anybody from that community? Do you have a friend? And the answer 70% of the time was no. And then he's like, how did you come to that conclusion? And it's like, my grandfather told me, oh, my community talked about it. And so it was all inherited prejudice, inherited opinions. And so we felt, well, that's not a hard thing to break. You know, real life experience can easily break inherited prejudices. So we were like, okay, that's what we need to do. Let's create bridges for people to meet these so called monsters on the other side and let them be blown away but what they've been missing out on. These are people just like them, have similar aspirations, have similar pains and struggles that they've been through. And what we could do together collectively is far more inspiring than what we've been doing apart. And so that built the youth movement. We were like, okay, let's bring people together. And over the years, I think we've engaged over 1 million youth across the country. We have over 30,000 young members joined the movement and said, yeah, we want to be the generation that dares to unite, a generation that's looking to transform our reality. We refuse to make the same mistakes. And that created a momentum and a movement in the post-war Sri Lanka that the soil was ripe for a harvest in that sense, you know. And so as we started doing work, social media, with the advent of social media, our opportunities to engage was even greater. We could get the message out across the country. But then we started getting people from different countries who were seeing what we were doing, saying, hey, we have similar problems in our country. We have tensions across tribal lines. We have very little opportunities for youth. They're frustrated. Their unemployment is high, and they can easily get radicalized into violent extremism. We could do something like this. So we're like, we're a small island nation doing our own thing. We don't have the resources to be going elsewhere. But that kind of came a moment where, we really felt, hey, we feel the pain of what these countries are going through. When we talk to friends online from Congo or Uganda or even Afghanistan, we're like, we know your pain. But most of the intervention is from the West in countries that haven't experienced a civil war or conflict at that level in centuries. And they don't know the pain. They don't have the agency. Neither do they have the insight of what sort of interventions work. And most of the time, the interventions were designed in Washington, D.C. or somewhere in Europe, and then they come and try and implement it. This should work. Very little questioning of from the grassroots, what do you need? What works? What doesn't work? Very little understanding of the historical context as well. More often than not, it's just some academic came and did a research paper in our country and they became an expert in it after spending 2 weeks on the ground or maybe even 2 months on the ground. And that became the gold standard of what the intervention should look like. And so we're like, none of this is working. But we had people on the ground who had a heart for the country, who had a vision and a strategy and wanted to give their heart and soul to do something. They had $0 behind their idea. And then you had an expert who wrote a book about a country, visiting our country for a month or two, with a very powerful INGO behind them that had like $1 million behind their idea. So eventually people are like, I'll just get employment working for this initiative. I know it's not going to work. I know it's not going to bring a change, but at least I'm employed. So that's why billions of dollars spent in intervention coming in from the West, unfortunately, hasn't really had the results that was expected. And so we felt, hey, we need to be a global South movement because we care and let's engage. And so we started writing our own content. We started doing our own research. It became like a collective of the global South saying, let's respond. So I remember taking a team of Sri Lankans to Congo and launching Congo Unites. And we were like, what are we doing here? We don't even know anything about Africa, but we get a sense for what you guys are going through. We've lived through war. We lived through violence. This is what a reconciliation movement could look like. And so we helped them contextualize the model. Next thing you know, we had Congo Unites. Today, Congo Unites has over 14,000 members engaging all across the massive nation of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Next, Uganda, Kenya. Long story short, today we're engaged in different levels in 21 countries. We have about 35 to 40 staff working in all these countries, headquartered here in Sri Lanka, registered as a nonprofit in the United States, and now in Germany. And now we're getting invitations from the West because there's tensions across racial lines, tensions across immigrant and native lines, and we're getting opportunities to go and serve to build. So we just launched Germany Unites, Netherlands Unites is on the way, United Kingdom. We have operations now launched in the US. So it's an interesting model of focus for the Global South, but now learning lessons from here to engage youth even in the Western Hemisphere. So it's been an amazing journey, which is our 11th year. And we've found ways of doing things in a sustainable manner financially. How do you really increase volunteers and have a strong ownership on the ground? Create businesses alongside the nonprofits so that you're sustainable. And so we're slowly learning and we're serious about making impact. And with the loss of rather large INGOs and USAID shutting down and all that, we're looking at that as an opportunity, saying, hey, more opportunity for grassroots initiatives to do our thing. And we can generate income. And let's look at the crisis as an opportunity for maybe some meaningful work in the years to come.
Yeah, I think that that's the right approach. as scary in many regards as the USAID pullout from last year and all the subsequent pullouts. Um, it's nonetheless, there has to be opportunity, and we didn't, none of us that are working for nonprofits or global INGOs, or whether they're based in Asia like yours or based somewhere else, like, we did we get into it for the money? I don't know. I hope not. Like, hopefully we just got into it because it's important work to do justice and development and peace building throughout the world. So yeah, we just got to keep going. What's interesting, Prashant, something I didn't mention, um, it was kind of interesting just the way you kind of framed that, and I think it's very well founded, just in terms of kind of the some of the models, some of the theories, some of the writing around peace building in the global South is originating with scholars in the West. And like you said, this is not like a lived experience. You grew up in Sri Lanka, in those 30 years of conflict. Same with the Congo. I mean, Eastern Congo is like that, where you guys had your second chapter. Um, there's a level of expertise that comes with that there's no way that a PhD from such and such university. What's interesting is, and I almost kind of want to hear you juxtapose this. You have a graduate degree from Notre Dame. So you also have a Western education from a prestigious university. Is the lived experience and what you guys are doing on the grassroots just even that much better? How was even doing grad school at a prestigious Catholic university like Notre Dame? How do you kind of wrestle with that, or think through that?
No, that's a great question. So that's one of the reasons I even applied for grad school as well as doing all this work. You realize that in order to be seen favorably for certain grants and to be taken seriously in what you're writing and what you're producing, you need some sort of pedigree that the world acknowledges. And if you can't just say, "Hey, I've been doing this work on the ground for 20 years, take my work seriously." You need to also have that pedigree. So, like, okay, let me apply. And I was reading some of the professors who had done work there, and I was and I wanted to go and engage, and I was fortunate to get my opportunity there. But when I tell even my at University of Notre Dame, I told them my greatest learning happened from my peers of 20 practitioners from different parts of the world coming together, living together for 2 years, and we learned so much from each other. We would meet every Friday night for a dinner. We'll spend hours together talking about our life stories, our lived experience, our strategies. We got better understanding of different religious traditions, different cultural realities. It was the richest experience. And we said the best thing about this is you brought us all together to spend and do life together. That was learning from the lived experience of my cohort was number one. Number two is we do have in the West some people who are acknowledging this reality of, expertise doesn't come just by writing a paper or doing some work there. We do have, Notre Dame had this reality of scholar practitioners, people who are academics who are putting things or doing the research, but at the same time they have lived life in the sense of they've lived extended times working with local groups, leading initiatives on the ground. And so it was a good balance of meeting with some of them as well. But we were also there to try and challenge the structures, to saying we can't have these opinions and not go to the places and let them know, hey, this has to change.
So when we talk about peace building, one of the words that you use is conflict transformation, and I like that phrase, because it's basically like assuming, obviously, that there's a start point, which is conflict, but it's not just like absence of hostilities. Like, no, we're actually trying to transform a dynamic into something that hopefully would be holistic, thriving. Can you just kind of describe, when you say conflict transformation, how synonymous is that with peace building? Just kind of unpack that phrase a little bit to kind of set the stage.
Yeah, this was the father of conflict transformation is Dr. John Paul Lederach. He's a phenomenal teacher and a scholar practitioner who I met when I was at Notre Dame. He was one person with significant on the ground practical experience and then taking time to write and express what it was about. So conflict transformation is like a move away from terms like it is different to terms like conflict resolution, conflict management, conflict mitigation. All those things, for the most part, seem to have more of a short-term emphasis. But conflict transformation is having an ability to look at the ebbs and flows of conflict You learn from the patterns and the history of how things have happened, and you try to now position yourself to, well, these existing realities, how do you bring out a transformed reality for the people from that? Because you can't really avoid conflict in itself. This is going to come again, but how would you look at it differently? And it's really looking into the root causes of conflict. And then you look into the historical narratives of how that root cause has been created. So any initiatives that you're doing to just manage the symptoms or attack the symptoms is not going to give you sustainable peace. It's not going to give you a holistic peace. It might reduce violence temporarily, but unfortunately, as we've seen in many conflict zones, it's reoccurring, regardless of how much effort you put into it. So conflict transformation teaches you to not just look at the ebbs and flows of conflict, but also really understand the root causes and attack those root causes in your interventions with a deep understanding of historical realities. And then also looking at what does a desired future look like for all of us who are entangled in this current mess, and how do we go towards that. So once you have that holistic picture and a holistic peace building, a strategic peace building mindset, then the investment of your time, your resources, your energy, you're more likely to have value for money with long-term sustainable results as opposed to a temporary relief from the violence that you're experiencing.
Yeah. So one of the times when we were previously talking, Prashan, you talked about these four common principles. Is that coming from the same author and leader that you were just describing? Is that his framework? When you broke that down into those four common principles, I was like, oh, okay, that's something I can wrap my head around. Can you walk us through that a little bit and just kind of where that
Yeah.
framework came from?
So this is something we created building off of our own research and learning. So we decided there are going to be four pillars for our movement. This is what the movement's built on in Sri Lanka and around the world. Number one is our commitment to nonviolence, because you have a new generation who some are not fully convinced that nonviolence can bring about change, who believe that, taking up arms and fighting the state or fighting the opposer, that's going to bring about the solutions that you're looking for. But in fact, the damage that it causes is in fact worse. Nonviolence is crucial to try and help a generation see that nonviolently opposing injustice is far more effective than violently opposing it. The damage and the long-term loss is far greater. And there's a lot of reading and teaching on this by Dr. Erica Chenoweth and her research of looking at nonviolent movements and how they're far superior to violent movements in bringing about the outcomes. The second component, our pillar, is grassroots movements. Like we don't believe in a top-down model of bringing about justice and peace and healing from policy alone. It has to be initiated through the grassroots, through the common man, and built up. And then policy changes happen when people have been fully convinced and embracing that this is the reality that we need to build. So it's grassroots, ordinary people coming together to bring about, collectively bring about sustainable change in your societies. So there's real ownership of the people. It's not forced. It's not it's not window dressing. It comes authentically from the people that they're wanting to bring about change. So we really believe in creating grassroots movements. And third component is youth leadership and culture. Sorry, youth leadership and character. And when we talked about it, because we really want to see, it's the next generation has the most to lose if this doesn't go right. So we have to make sure that we have youth leadership. More often than not, you got tokenism, where you have some young people seated around the table and you're like, oh, we have youth represented here. It's just an afterthought. But this has to be led, pioneered, envisioned, and guided by youth leadership. We believe then they have true ownership. They have great ideas. They're less jaded by the realities of the past, and they're able to think outside the box and bring about opportunities for healing, justice, and thriving that were not even considered before. So really promoting youth leadership and making it a central point of our intervention. But leadership with character. We don't want youth leadership mimicking the corrupt leadership they've seen of generations before. We've got to instill with them leaders of character and integrity and transparency, and that level of leadership to be taught at a very young age and then platformed to serve accordingly. The fourth pillar is reconciliation and conflict transformation. So reconciliation, when we're talking about we use the Hebrew word tikkun olam, which means heal, repair, and transform. So the Hebrew word for reconciliation is tikkun olam, and tikkun olam means three English words: heal, repair, transform. It's not one of these three things. It's all these three things intertwined and working together. that is a sense of reconciliation. What's the point of healing the wounds if you don't repair the structures that cause the wounds and reopen old wounds and create new wounds? So you have to collectively now work at repairing broken structures. It's not reconciliation just because you hug it out. It's reconciliation when you're now working to repair the broken structure. So we're trying to encourage you now work across enemy lines to repair the broken, unfair, unjust structures in your society, because as long as those exist, reconciliation won't be sustainable. But then that's not good enough. It's transformed. Now, how do you think of a desired future, a collective for you, your people together? Well, a vision for your children's future across ethnic and religious lines, and you start marching towards that. That's your new rallying call. That's your new marching call. That's what gets you excited. So those three things working together is true reconciliation, and it doesn't happen overnight. It's not a destination. It is a process, and always asking the questions: Are we healing? Are we repairing? And are we transforming? But then that dovetails nicely with the whole concept of conflict transformation, where it's not a one off thing, or you're not just trying to mitigate conflict for a certain temporary period. You're trying to understand the ebbs and flows of conflict and trying to figure out what are the root causes and how do you engage that? What are the broken relationships? What are the broken structures? And it's like a holistic view of saying your approach is very focused. It's like looking at the iceberg analogy of you're not trying to represent the or try to attack the tip of the iceberg, you're going after the root of it itself. That's the only way we'll have a thriving future. If not, it's just more war and more violence in the years to come.
Yeah, I love that. I love that framework and the way that you describe it, even wrapping in the Hebrew. That's one of the things I love when I've taught like on like a word like hesed. Man, there's just so much that's kind of wrapped up in that. So I love that you even like took one of those weighty words to kind of describe how you guys go about reconciliation and transformation and conflict transformation. Um, this is a framework that I can see and you are seeing work in places like South Asia, but also East Africa. Also now, as you were describing earlier, Western countries. Kind of how much of this is kind of like out of the box, I mean, versus like contextualization? How do you get up and go? Our last conversation that we had on the show is with Craig Greenfield, and Alongsiders International is in 30, and they're also very movement oriented, more than just like we're setting up operations for our, NGO or whatever. No, it's really about the youth movement. So I'm seeing a lot of similarities there. But how do you guys kind of think through and address that contextualization when you are going, across pretty diverse cultures?
Yeah, so definitely, if there's one lesson we've learned about intervention and development work of the last 3 decades, is that copy paste solutions never work. In fact, end up doing more damage than good and wasting of resources at a very high level. And so, what we've learned is, you have to have an approach of researching and sitting on the ground, talking with key stakeholders, spending time to understand what's that reality. And then you share your story of what you're going through. And more often than not, what we realized is there's so much common ground in what we've been through, but then there's also so many variants in the type of conflict, how it initiated, what's going on, the actors at play. And so they themselves, once you give them a framework of this is how we thought about our conflict, and this is how we are responding, and this is how our team in Uganda is doing it, here's what Congo is doing it. How can you use this framework to think through yours? What would you think? Do you think this is helpful? And then they create their strategies, they create their models based on that thinking. Many of us haven't had the freedom to think for ourselves and do something because we've never had the resources or the opportunity to do so freely. So now we've collected the resources and the strategies and new ways of gaining resources that we go and say, if you could think for yourself and respond as you see fit, thinking through a framework like this, what would it look like? And unfortunately, more often than not, it looks nothing like what's happening with existing
Yeah.
initiatives. And so, if they had the freedom, and more often than not, I would say, hey, trust yourself. You are the expert to your country's context. Now, you have the most to lose here. You are passionate about it. There's no such person as an expert because they haven't been doing work. Let's take a surgeon, for example. A surgeon can have all the book knowledge they have, but until and unless they do the surgeries under guidance and over the years, they're no expert. They just have the book knowledge. They have to do it. Who's been an expert in your context? They may have written about it, but have they done it over and over again? Have they had? They haven't. So they're not the experts either. But you've been here doing it over and over again. Now you write your theory, figure it out, put to practice what you put, and then you start realizing you've got the theory, you have the practice. Now what's working, what's not working, it's your future at stake. You have the agency that nobody has. And now go for it. Engage. And then your question is like, oh, we don't have the funding. How can we make it? Take the first step. How much does this cost? Well, how can we raise that? How can we convince people who really care about our countries to invest in local initiatives to see long-term change? And how do you build the skill to persuade people to invest in the right place? And more often than not, what we've realized is we're raising 1/10 of what other initiatives are raising. It doesn't cost us that much because we have local buy-in. And so that's kind of how we've tried to contextualize it in each location.
Yeah, I love that, and love with the buy-in, the investment. This is really helpful, and I would just encourage our listeners. So I will put the website for Global Unites in the show notes if you want to check out what Prashan and their movement is doing across multiple countries. As an American, I'm excited to hear, the beginning stages of what you guys are doing here. We all I any podcast, anytime I go online to look at news, it's always about polarization and conflict and all of this. And I'll just say, like, when I think about these four common principles and conflict transformation, we need this as much as any nation here in the U.S. So I would encourage all of our listeners, wherever you're listening from, definitely check out the show notes and click over onto Global Unites. Prashan, I've learned so much from this conversation and from past conversations with you. We do have one final question that we ask everyone on the show. So for someone who is listening, for just anyone who is pursuing God's heart for justice in the nations, what would be one thing that you would recommend that they do?
Yeah, I think if you are pursuing justice in the nations, the good news is that your heart is positioned or listening to what's going on, that you're sensitive, that you have a heart that's willing to not numb yourself to that reality, not be overwhelmed or apathetic by it, but you're willing to be still and hearing that and feeling that. And now I feel the next step is how do you act? What's your first step? And most people are overwhelmed by the challenges that they don't know what their next step is. But I always go back to Psalms 119 where it says, Thy word is a lamp unto my feet. A lamp just gives us enough light, just enough light to see the next step. And when you make that step, then it gives you enough light to see the next step. It never says, Thy word is floodlights to my life, where you see everything, bam, here's a journey of justice, and it's all done. If it was floodlights to my life, I will be overwhelmed. I wouldn't be prepared. I wouldn't be strong enough to witness the challenges ahead to want to embark on this journey. So in His grace and mercy, He's just given us one light, that breaking of your heart to see the brokenness of society, to take that first step. So take it, whatever it looks like, and then take the next. It's a life of faithfulness, and my idea is many steps of faithfulness, daily faithfulness, when you feel like it, when you feel that you're competent, when you feel like you're well-funded, and when you're not. And you're completely a
Yeah.
disaster, but you're still looking to be faithful and doing it humbly. Sometimes what happens is when we're doing this work, and maybe not many people get it, you can get self-righteous and feel like all of you are wrong and I'm right. No, Lord, by your mercies I'm here. Walk humbly and do justly. And if you can have that balance, then the chances of you being effective for the work that you're doing are much higher. But if you lose that balance, you're not doing justice and you're not humble, then the likeliness of you and I causing more damage than good is also very high. So it's a very thin line to walk, a thin road to walk, but I believe by His grace it's possible.
Amen. Amen. That is a good word, brother. Yeah, it's a journey of faith. It's a one step at a time. That is a good word to end on. Prashan, thank you so much for coming on the show, man. I learned a lot. I love this conversation and love the work that Global Unites is doing. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Brandon. I enjoyed my time with you as well.
And Amen. And for our listeners, may Almighty God, who created us in His own image, grant us grace to fearlessly contend against evil and to make no peace with oppression, that we may reverently use our freedom and employ it in the maintenance of justice in our communities and among the nations, to the glory of God's holy name, through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with the Father and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. And we will catch you guys on the next episode of Think Global, Do Justice.